Hello, I'm George Brown, and I want to welcome you to another in our episodes of Armchair Traveler. Let's start over again. Hello, I'm George Brown, and I want to welcome you to the Armchair Traveler. Today, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. In previous sessions, we've looked at very exotic places to travel, from the Silk Road of Asia to Iceland and Greenland, to England, and out west with the Great America Road Trip. But today I want to challenge you to think about traveling closer to home, both in terms of armchair travel, but also in terms of future actual travel. Each of us lives in a region. In my case, it's in the American South. Same for you in many instances. And very often we're not as familiar with our own region as we might be. So there's a lot we can explore in our own region. And I would go one step beyond that. As an armchair traveler, we like to explore, but we can also reflect. We can reflect on what it means to be part of a particular region and the heritage of our own region. So we're really traveling like a tourist, but with a different kind of approach, because we're not traveling as a foreigner, as an outsider, but as a local. And so it gives us a different perspective, and maybe it can give us perspective on our own region. I'm sure you've had experience that I have, where someone comes to visit you from far away, and you actually go see places close by that otherwise you might never have gone to. I had this experience about 20 years ago. A good friend of mine, Gerald from New Zealand, was in town for meetings, and he was staying in our home. He arrived on a Saturday evening, long flights from New Zealand and California. And when he got here, the next morning, Sunday morning, we're up, and I say, Gerald, I know you're tired. You may just want to take it easy today because we don't have any meetings until tomorrow. Or maybe you want to go to church. I didn't know what his interests were on a Sunday morning. He says, no. He says, George, I want to go to the Classic Car Museum. I said, what are you talking about? He says, well, out near Stone Mountain, there's a classic car museum. And I knew Gerald liked classic cars. He had a beautifully restored 1936 Studebaker that I'd seen when I visited him in New Zealand. And I said, oh, Gerald, I'm afraid it probably won't be open on Sunday. He says, no, I checked it on the internet from home. He says it opens at 8:30 this morning. And so we got in the car and we went the 30-minute drive out to this classic car museum. I never would have gone there. And it turned out to be a fascinating museum, not just for the old automobiles, but all of the descriptions and the layouts they had for American culture in this region in the earlier days. And so it just brought home to me the reality that there's a lot we can see and learn from our own region. Now, in the South, where we are right now, I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. And so what I want to do is take a few minutes to look at a couple of regions, a couple of areas in our region that are good for both armchair travel and actual travel. So let's take a look at two places in particular. This would be Asheville, North Carolina, which is about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta. And the other is the state of Kentucky, a little farther away, but not too far by a long shot. So first, let's take a look at the map from Atlanta. And I have a map here that shows a bit of a range, the 500-mile radius from Atlanta. And you can see that from here, we can, in 500 miles, is a long, long day trip, but it can be done in a day or two. And you see, we really encompass a fascinating part of our country. In 500 miles, we're deep into Florida, go just a little farther and you're down to the Keys. We go up through all the state of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, all the way up over to St. Louis and up close to the Washington, D.C. area, as well as the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina. So really a wide range of areas that we can explore from right here in Atlanta. And what I want to do is take you in two areas. One is just from Atlanta up here to western North Carolina, up to the mountains around Asheville. And the other will be the state of Kentucky, just 2 states away. So let's take a look at some of the areas we can explore. Asheville and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Some of you went with me. Last year we went to Asheville around Christmas time, just for 2 days. But you go up, you get into the to the southern part of the Appalachian Mountains, what we call the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's a beautiful part of the country. And if we go there to Asheville in particular, there are a number of themes that you can explore. And so here's where the armchair travel technique comes in. As you think about these different themes, these are areas you can explore on your own without having to actually travel to Asheville. But because it's so close, it also means that if you do some armchair travel exploring, you know that before too long, you could get in a car and go up there and see it in person. You'll go up through the Smoky Mountains and across the Blue Ridge Parkway. Blue Ridge Parkway, many of you have been on, is one of the outstanding infrastructure projects of the last century. The National Park Service says it's the most visited unit of the National Park Service. It links 2 of our great national parks, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is the most visited national park, and the Shenandoah National Park up in Virginia. More than 400 miles of the scenic highway that weaves its way through the mountains between the Smokies and Northern Virginia. And it goes right past Asheville. So if you go up to Asheville, you can certainly take time to take a ride on the Blue Ridge Parkway. It's well worth it. One of the reasons to go to Asheville is to see the great Biltmore Estate. And here I show an aerial view of Biltmore. If you're from this area, you've probably been to Biltmore. And before I went there with some of you last year, I read this book, The Last Castle, by Denise Kiernan. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it to you if you're going to Asheville at all. It tells the story of the Vanderbilt family and the building of this audacious big castle type home that they built. So it's the largest house in America, as it were. It's like a giant hotel, if you want to know the truth. But it tells the story not only of George Vanderbilt and his family, how they came to Asheville to build this, but it also, in telling that story, tells the story of Asheville and the surrounding area in the first half of the 20th century. It's fascinating. George Vanderbilt came with his mother to Asheville in the 1880s as people from the North would, to get the fresh air. They felt that that was good for their health. And he fell in love with the mountains, and he bought land and bought more land and more land. And instead of building his big estate up on the Hudson River or in Rhode Island like his contemporary wealthy Americans were, he said he was going to build it here in the mountains of North Carolina. And so he did. And you have this great estate, but the history of both the building itself, but also the gardens, the forest, you see here on the left, part of the gardens that are there, the formal gardens, but the formal gardens are set back from the forest. George Vanderbilt instituted the first real forestry project in the United States, having the experts in the emerging industry or field of forestry help reestablish the forest all around Biltmore. And on the right, you see at Christmas time. We went last year, some of us, to Biltmore during Christmas with all the splendor there. But you see the great house with the magnificent Blue Ridge Mountains in the background. But again, I recommend the book, The Last Castle, as a great way of learning not just about the Vanderbilts and the building of this great house, but also Asheville in general. Another big house, it's Grove Park Inn. Some of you may have been there. This was built around 1910. The Biltmore finished his great estate. The Biltmore House was completed in 1895. About 15 years later, you have the Grove Park Inn built. It was St. Louis, wealthy St. Louis tycoon, business tycoon, also came to Asheville with his mother and decided to build a big lodge, a big hotel. He wanted to pattern it a bit after the one that had recently been built at Yellowstone National Park. So you can see some similarities there. But it's built as a hotel, opened in 1913, hosted many famous people through the years. They have the room where F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed when he was there as well. But it's a first-class hotel now, and you can go and stay there or just go as we did for dinner. You see there on the left, the big dining room with the fireplace, and on the right, the terrace where you can sit and watch the sunset over the western hills of North Carolina. So the Biltmore, it's another great place to visit when you're in Asheville. There's a smaller house, and when we were there last year, this was a real eye-opener for me. Thomas Wolfe, the famous American early 20th century writer, best known maybe for his book, Look Homeward Angel. His mother ran a boarding house in North Carolina. So you can see set among these great houses of Biltmore, Grove Park Inn, there were dozens of these boarding houses. People would come for their health and they would stay in a boarding house. Thomas Wolfe's mother's boarding house, the rent was $8 a week. And you would stay there, you'd sit on the porch in your rocking chair, take in the fresh air that was supposedly would cure you from your ills. But this home, Thomas Wolfe died early, and his mother continued to have the house for many years later. And when she died, it was quickly converted to a memorial for Thomas Wolfe. And so it's kept up very much the way it was when she ran it as a boarding house. So I found the tour there to be quite good. There's a museum. You can't see the museum here in the picture, the museum with the film about Thomas Wolfe and his life. But then you go through this house and you get a very good picture of what life was for the ordinary people, not the Vanderbilts and the Groves, but the ordinary people in Asheville in the early part of the 20th century. So you have these historic buildings that really, you can get a feel for the history, the 20th century history of Asheville as a town in the mountains of North Carolina. But there are other themes you can explore. One great one is mountain music. And when we were up there, we had a presentation or on a little concert by a woman who's not only a great performer, but understands the history and has delved into the history of the mountain music that comes from Ireland, trace the roots back to Ireland and Appalachian Mountains, the instruments that they have, as well as the songs. So when you're in Asheville or when you're exploring from your armchair, here's where you can go on YouTube and listen to some of the great mountain music, get a feel for the origin of the mountain or hillbilly music as we know it today. It's a great part of the American mountain tradition in Western North Carolina. There's great folk art traditions as well, the quilting, the pottery. Just outside of Asheville on the Blue Ridge Parkway is the Folk Art Center. And you can go there, they have demonstrations, but also they sell all of the handicrafts from people that have made them in the region. So it's great to see both in terms of the music, but also in terms of the arts, the folk arts, how the traditional arts are being kept alive in Western North Carolina today. Another thing that's interesting about Asheville is the Art Deco buildings from the 1920s. They tell me that Asheville, after Miami, Florida, there are more Art Deco buildings in Asheville than any other city in the United States. And the interesting reason for this is that when the Depression came, Asheville, unlike many cities, decided not to go bankrupt and to honor its city bonds, even though the city was in dire economic straits. And so all through the 1940s and 50s, Asheville is paying off its debt rather than going into some 1950s or 1960s style urban renewal. And so where other towns might have torn these buildings down and built shopping malls or big skyscrapers in the 1960s, in Asheville, they didn't have the money to do that. Luckily for us, because it means today there's great variety of Art Deco buildings that you can enjoy just walking around the downtown area of Asheville. Very walkable. 15 or 20 minutes you can walk through the downtown area. So you have these different themes that you can explore, and then there's just a fantastic scenery of the mountains in western North Carolina. So again, I would say both as an armchair traveler, there's plenty you can explore. But one of the nice things about doing the armchair travel of our own region is that it's easy to imagine that before too long you'll be able to travel to Asheville. As I said, some of us went last year for 3 days up there, and I'm sure if you're like me, that wasn't long enough, and you'd like to go back, maybe a different season this time. So think of your armchair traveling as an opportunity to really explore some areas in your region, and I think you'll find that rewarding. So from Atlanta, a little farther away, but not too far, is Kentucky. And what I find is that whereas most people living in Atlanta have been to Charleston and Savannah and Asheville, many of us have not taken the time to explore the next state up of Kentucky. It's a great logo they have, Kentucky Unbridled Spirit, with the famous horse here. So we think about excuse me, about Kentucky, you think about the bluegrass, you think about the horses, the thoroughbred horses. There are two great racetracks, Keeneland and then Churchill Downs, where the Kentucky Derby is run. Is also in Lexington, the Kentucky Horse Park. It's a great park really that tells all about the raising, the breeding, and the racing of the horses. But just as interesting as to drive through the countryside, you see the magnificent farms with the horses there. It's just a great part of the Kentucky tradition. I don't have a book to recommend, but I'm sure there's some great books if you're interested in horses, horse racing, to explore the tradition there and to learn why it is, how it is that Kentucky's become a premier place for raising horses, breeding horses, and racing horses. Another thing that brings people to Kentucky is bourbon. And there's the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Bourbon, by definition, has to be made in Kentucky. And there's a great opportunity to go and to tour some of the distilleries. If you're staying in Louisville, it's not too far. There's like I say, a bourbon trail. You can go from Louisville. Each of these barrels represents a different distillery. And a great way to spend a day or two is to go from distillery to distillery, these relatively small towns, and you can get a sense for the tradition of making the great American whiskey, bourbon. Now, at the end of doing that for a day, if you're feeling a little guilty, you could go not too far away to the Abbey of Gethsemane. So if you were sinning with all your drinking in the morning, then you can become a saint in the afternoon and go over to the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is a Trappist monastery, a very famous Trappist monastery. And you can have tours there and learn about the Trappist tradition, which is maintained to this day. This particular monastery made famous probably because of the famous writings of the Trappist monk Thomas Merton back in the 1950s and 60s. So his famous book, The Seven-Story Mountain, is about his experiences from being an activist, social activist, to becoming a Trappist monk. A friend of mine recently gave me a box of fudge from the monastery. You see, it's not my picture, but a picture from their website of the fudge that they make there is great. They have a great gift shop there, so you can go to the monastery, learn about that tradition, and walk away with some great fudge. There are other things in Kentucky. This just really it's just a surface of things that can be done in Kentucky. If you're a sports car enthusiast, you head over to Bowling Green, which is the home of the Corvette. The Chevrolet Corvette factory is there, along with the museum. I've not been there, but they say it's a fascinating history of the development of the Corvette, along with other American sports cars. Muhammad Ali, as you probably remember, is from Kentucky. And in Louisville, there's a great center, the Muhammad Ali Center. Be great, do great things. And this is a great monument to one of the greatest athletes of the 20th century, and one of our great African-American leaders in this country as well. And while we're on sports, those of you who are baseball fans will be familiar with the Louisville Slugger. The Louisville Slugger is the bat that is used by Major League Sports even to this day. And the factory and museum for the Louisville Slugger is right in downtown Louisville, not surprising. And while we're in Louisville, also remember it's on the Ohio River, the Great Ohio River, and you can take a boat ride, a cruise along the Ohio River as it winds its way through Kentucky over to the Mississippi River. There are other things in Kentucky. Mammoth Cave National Park over in western Kentucky, one of the largest underground caves in the country. And in Paducah, Kentucky is a National Quilt Museum. So if you're into making quilts, it's a couple hours drive from Louisville, you can go there. So again, many different themes that you can explore in a state like Kentucky. And I use Kentucky along with Asheville just to kind of illustrate the kinds of explorations that we can do, both from our armchair, by reading, by looking on the internet, by enjoying learning about some of these areas, but also because they're relatively easy to visit. And in this era of limited travel, when we don't know what kind of travel we'll be able to do in the next year or two, it's worth thinking about traveling closer to home and how we might enjoy travel in our own region. So Kentucky, welcome to the Bluegrass State, one of the great areas that we can explore. Now, if you're from the South, one of the questions is, what is the South today? It's a changing region, both culturally, and if you look at the guidebook, excuse me, there's a new guidebook, This Is My South. It's also a website that tries to give more off the beaten path suggestions for traveling in the South. There's another magazine that I don't know much about. It's kind of like an updated version of Southern Living called Garden and Gun. I think the name comes from some club or a restaurant that's called Garden and Gun, but it purports to be a more contemporary version. Here's a recent issue about heroes of the South, where they pick 30 people from the South. One that was interesting to me is an African-American woman did some research who found out that at the Jack Daniel's distillery in Tennessee, that the technique for making the whiskey there, the Jack Daniel's whiskey, was developed by an African-American worker for Jack Daniel's. And so he's highlighted. So you have some people that normally we might not have known about that are being highlighted today. Several weeks ago on one of our earlier sessions, we talked about the American road trip. And I mentioned the Green Book, which was developed back in the 1920s as a guide for African Americans traveling around the country in the era of segregation, enforced segregation, giving African Americans information on where they could travel, eat, stay safely in that era. Well, what I found out is that there's a new book, The Green Book of South Carolina, a travel guide to South Carolina African American cultural sites. And I think here's where our regional travel today, particularly if you're a Southerner like I am. I haven't lived in the South all my life, but my heritage is from here, that we can do reflection in our armchair travel about the South, about our region, and maybe how to reimagine the heritage and how we view the heritage of the South. It's a difficult time. It's a difficult area to think about in terms of how we deal with the tradition of race discrimination and bigotry and white supremacy. As our Confederate monuments are coming down, it seems to me that that's not enough, that we should be able to explore then a broader way of defining the South. So we think not just in terms of how it was when we grew up. When I moved to Atlanta, or shortly after I moved here in the open CNN Center, they were showing Gone with the Wind every day. And we have to remember that the big Confederate carving at Stone Mountain was actually completed after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And so the remnants of that era are very much alive in this region. And in a time when there's attempts to tear that down, to remove that, which is needed, badly overdue, the question is how we can develop a relationship with our region where we look at the broader heritage, not just the white European heritage, but how we can incorporate the heritage of the African Americans, the other immigrants, communities that really built the South. So that's a challenge for us as we look at the South as a region, to go and enjoy the places in North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina that we've always enjoyed visiting, but that we do it with a new eye, that we see if we can visit in our own region in a way that takes into account the traditions, the heritage of other peoples. So that's the message, I guess, for today. It's explore your own region through your armchair travel. But as you do that, because it's your own region, because you're not a foreigner, an outsider, you do it from the inside perspective. And so it's a great way to include the reflective part of Armchair Travel as well. So thank you very much. I look forward to being with you again.